Now, in 2024, Palestinian displacement entered its 76th year, and yet the world still calls it a crisis, as if decades of exiles were temporary, and as if millions were just waiting to go home. But Palestine isn't alone. From Syria's northwest to Sudan's desert to Libya's detention center, millions, and I say millions, they live under temporary protection with no end in sight. When it comes to displacement, you've got to acknowledge it's temporary, and it isn't temporary for some. It's structural, it's designed from camps in Lebanon to across borders in North Africa and Europe. Displacement has become a system that feeds on bureaucracy, aid, neglect, and above all, care or the lack of it. Now, as we see our governments debate and donors, they fund endless programs, displaced individuals, they wait. But here's the caveat. They don't wait passively. They are hustling, they're organizing, they're surviving, not with capital, but with necessity. This is Builders of the Broken Bazaar. I am Dr. Tabish Zaman, and today we confront displacement not as crisis, but as infrastructure, not to help, but to manage. Again, not to empower, but to contain. We ask very different questions here. Not how do we solve refugee crisis, but what if displacement is the system? What if it's an industry, one that governs over 100 million lives, not to integrate, but to manage indefinitely? My guest today has spent over a decade inside that system, not just as a researcher, but as a critic, which is very, very important, and witness to how humanitarianism truly works. Dr. Philip Proudfoot is a political anthropologist whose work spans Lebanon, Yemen, Gaza, Iraq. I can name a few. He's advised UNDP, ILO, OCHA, and has led evaluations of major humanitarian operations, including the most recent, the $16 billion Yemen response. His book, Rebel Populism, tells the story of Syrian migrant workers in Lebanon, men trapped in economic exile who turned survival into existence. Philip's research shows how displacement operates as global governance, where aid, labor, power collide, and humanitarianism becomes a system of control, not just care. So today, we unpack that system and what it means for those forced to live with it. So, Philip, welcome to the show. It's an absolute honor to have you on this podcast.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation. And yeah, it's excellent to be here and to discuss these really important topics. All of those topics I can talk about forever. So we should probably get started.
We've got the right person then. And thank you so much once again to bring your work into this. So before we dive into the big system, the big structure, I really want to slow it down and, start on a very reflective note, which I believe is the single most biggest issue as of now. You've spent a lot of time with people in very precarious situation, and that's not just research, it's your life, I believe. So my question to you is, how are you carrying that right now? When you look at what's happening in Gaza, in Syria, in Sudan, and so many other parts of the world, how does it sit with you?
Well, if you're meaning emotionally, it hits me at strange times. So I spend a lot of time fighting, and the fighting, I think, is what keeps me sane, is that I keep fighting about these things. I keep writing about them. I keep advocating for them. But sometimes I'll just be at the gym and then I'll start thinking about the fact that there are people likely falling under bombs or starving while they're in Gaza, and that my own government is providing political, military cover, direct military intelligence to support that attack in Gaza, and that kind of fills me with moments of acute dread. And then the way I deal with it is that I try to maintain faith in the idea that the crimes in Palestine and the crimes elsewhere, but the crimes in Palestine in particular, due to the relationship between global North governments and Israel, are such that there will be accountability, and that I want to be part of that effort to generate accountability for political leaders in my own country and political leaders elsewhere who have failed in their most basic obligations to prevent genocide. Like, the way I try to fit with it is to feel the intense sense of dread. Remember that I am incredibly lucky to be able to even sit here and talk to you about these things. And then to use the position I have and the relative freedoms I have to advocate for accountability, hopefully starting now, but if not now, then in the future.
Thank you for that. I mean, these are very small, grounded moments, but in terms of the bigger picture, how do we actually react to the normalization of what is happening in Gaza, and again, from our far eyes in West Bank even? How do we give a word to it? And from a scholarly point of view, like yourselves, I look at refugee entrepreneurship, look at their displacement, look at the struggle, again, in a very different context. But what's that word we can give to the normalization of what we are seeing and the apathy which is going on in and around us?
I tend to think of it as impunity is the word that I would use. And I founded a project called the Accountability Archive, where individuals, anyone, can upload evidence of power holders using speech, public speech, either in articles, videos, interviews, posts, where they're advocating for the breaking of a particular aspect of international law. So my reaction to around how is this happening and what should we do about it, even as scholars, is that we all have a sense, and I think a lot of your listeners will have a sense, that the liberal world order is collapsing, and we have this sense that it's collapsing. But what we can do as scholars and researchers is we can evidence where that sense is coming from and how it's actually happening. And my contention and the Accountability Archive's infrastructure is to show that one of the ways in which that collapse is happening is through the sheer repeated consistency of speech that is in violation of international humanitarian law, or is advocating for violating international humanitarian law. So, for example, there's so many things that were said about Gaza that were proven to be incorrect. But by the time the proof came, already there had been so much speech saying that this thing was true. So, for example, countless hospitals claim to have Hamas military infrastructure underneath, and the evidence that's presented is a CGI video drawn up by the IDF, right? And then this video circulates and circulates and circulates, and then people start to say it again and again. When a hospital has a military infrastructure underneath it, it loses its protected status. Now, that might well be true under international law, but the evidence requirement is not a CGI video produced by a conflict belligerent. The evidence is hard evidence, not a CGI video. But we can show how often that was repeated. So, right back at the beginning, the Al-Ahli hospital in Gaza, the claim that was made was that it was a Hamas rocket backfiring. And then, a month later, forensic archaeologists and sound scientists, I don't know what the technical word is for them, were able to prove that it was not an internal rocket, but it was an external rocket. So it was an Israeli attack. But by the time that happened, the idea that it was carried out, it was a Hamas rocket backfiring, had already set into place, which then feeds into the growing discourse that normalizes attacks against hospitals.
Yeah.
So that I feel is what we can do, and how we can show that this level of kind of impunity has become normalized. It's normalized. I can give you so many examples. My favorite example, because it's a subtle example, is David Lammy, who's the foreign minister in Britain. He will often and has often said, we need a ceasefire to get the aid in. This sounds very reasonable, right? We need a ceasefire to get the aid in. Yeah. But actually, it fundamentally violates the foundational principles of humanitarian action. Aid is provided to people on the basis of need, not on the basis of the particular status of a conflict. You do not need a ceasefire to get aid in. When I worked in Yemen, there was no ceasefire. The aid was able to get in because more or less, of course, with some friction, there's always friction in negotiation, but more or less, the UN and other NGOs were accepted as providers of aid, and the conflict belligerents that did have air power, so in that case, Saudi Arabia, would be notified of a humanitarian movement, and they would not then attack the humanitarians going into that area, taking a shipment of food or what have you. Now, when Lamy says this, we need a ceasefire to get the aid in, what he should be saying is we need Israel to cease attacking aid workers in the United Nations and the Red Cross, right? This is what he should be saying, because then the aid can be got in at any point. It is not reliant on a ceasefire. But that simple act of saying that is eroding the post-World War II international humanitarian system. And he is remember, a representative of a country that sits on the Security Council, and the chief coordinator of the entire humanitarian system is traditionally awarded to a Brit. So we have a particular responsibility for the humanitarian system, and we have the minister who is responsible saying things that violate its foundational principles.
Yeah.
This is an example of how that impunity works.
And that was very well laid out in terms of the technical details. But what do you say to those? Because now I strongly believe this has become more of a humanitarian issue than a political or military issue at all. So for people like you and me who are sitting in the higher education space, what do you say to those who say this is very political? And how do we sort of go over the hoop and try to tell people that, look, this is beyond politics now, this is beyond military now, this is all about humans out there who are being brutalized, who are being killed, who are being starved at a scale we've never seen in our history or in our living memory.
Well, there are lots of contradictions around the relationship between humanitarian practice and politics. So, to start from the very top, the chief funders of the global humanitarian system, while there is some increasing money coming from the global south, it's still largely the global north states. So it's largely the European Union, America, Britain. These are the main funders of the system. But inevitably, when we look at how that system is deployed, it's deployed politically. So one of the only recent humanitarian funding calls that was almost fully funded was Ukraine, while at the same time, Sudan was barely funded. So this is reflecting geostrategic strategy and priorities. So there's a problem, and I'm writing a new book about this, about the ways in which the aid system has become a tool of Western foreign policy. So it's already political. Now, the second problem is that when something like a genocide happens so the genocide in Gaza is supposed to actually prompt a political response. So for aid workers to be able to do their job, which is not this problem of the ceasefire, the problem is that there's a blockade to even get the aid in.
Absolutely.
So there's a developed in sort of the 90s and 2000s, there's a diplomatic protocol called Responsibility to Protect, where all states who are signatories of the Genocide Convention are supposed to act in a way to prevent genocide from occurring. And they are supposed to then carry out a series of steps that can rise up to the threshold of collective military action to dismantle the blockades and allow aid in. And now this might sound far-fetched, but we have to remember we're talking about 2 million people. Starving. Thousands, 60,000 is the official figure.
Number,
but of course, the real figure is in the hundreds of thousands because of the complete collapse of the ability to count. And it only counts identifiable bodies, not people who are buried in rubble. So the true number, as the Lancet and others have argued, is in the hundreds of thousands. So this actually should be the point at which the international system kicks into gear and gives us a political response in order to then allow aid workers to go into the strip and start to prevent famine. Because the time is of the essence, like the famine requires a very particular series of care. So one of the problems with airdrops, for example, is if we just say, okay, there's no political solution, we can't get in, so now we're going to allow people to drop food in. Now, it's very insufficient. inefficient, right? It barely, one airdrop is barely one truck. It's nothing,
yeah.
right? But the other problem is that starving people will run to that food and eat it. And if they're in a situation of starvation, that can actually harm and kill them.
Absolutely.
Because you need special medical care to come out of a point of. So this is why there needs to be a political solution. So we can appeal to people by saying these are humans like us, but we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that political leaders have a responsibility to act in the face of genocide. But this,
and you
this
feel
is
it has completely collapsed in the face of what we are seeing right now. That whole system, whether locally or internationally, that is completely collapsed, and there is a complete absence of those individuals who could have or who should have moved some of those blocks. But what I'll do now, Philip, is I'll bring you a bit closer, because you've written, you've taught, and you've spoken about the after effects in terms of what happens when it comes to displacement for years now. So I want to go back to the beginning of your journey. So, what actually drew you into this world, this kind of field work and research? And I know, again, coming from ethnographic point of view, my own work, but again, it's a very different context. So for you, was it something personal? Was it all about academic, or again the political side of it, or was it a mix of all the three which drew you to this kind of fieldwork and research?
I was always I grew up in Northern England in a left-wing socialist family, so I've always been a left-wing socialist sort of person. And then when I went to university, I studied anthropology, and I had a very inspiring professor who she no longer taught the Middle East because she was at that time sick of the kind of controversies that can come around the Middle East, the same stuff we've just been talking about. So I asked her to, instead of giving me the ethnographies on, I don't know, somewhere else in the world, I said, can you recommend a similar one of the same theme, but about the Middle East? And then eventually she became my PhD supervisor. And then her name's Dr. Martha Mundy. And then I wanted to research. I was interested in masculinity and migration back then, and I wanted to study Syrian men. So I'd been learning Arabic in Damascus, and I had friends who were about to go into military service. And military service in Syria was a very long and difficult period of people's lives. It means you become non-economically productive. You get abused if you aren't from powerful families. There was lots of dislike of military service. So the men instead would plan to leave. And some of the men I knew were going to go to Beirut, and others were going to go to Doha. And I was going to kind of do a mobile ethnography looking at how they've I think we could even call them refugees, but they were basically just trying to avoid military service. And if you make enough money outside, you could then pay it off. So it was kind of a system. But then I wrote that proposal in 2011, and then the Syrian uprising started. And that meant I had to completely change it. I moved to Beirut and continued my Arabic studies there. And I decided that there was an existing book that I really admired called The Invisible Cage by John Chalcraft at LSE, which is about the history of Syrian workers in Lebanon. And he identifies how there was a pattern. So Syria and Lebanon has a free movement agreement, or had a long-standing free movement agreement, which meant that you never had a second generation of workers being born in Lebanon. They would work in Lebanon, and then they would go across as they got older back home and marry and start families. So there was a system in place of temporary labor. But then, and John argues in his book that it was basically through this temporariness, you had a process of non-coercive control. So if a Syrian worker wanted to increase their wages, the boss would just say, "Well, go. There's 1 million. You're not significant. I can replace you. Very dispensable. You can go." But then also the Syrian worker wanted to gain more money because Lebanon pays in dollars, and this cost of social reproduction for the family members. They're back in Syria, which had relatively higher levels of redistribution at a state level. So free education, healthcare, the farming used to be quite controlled by the state. So you'd had guaranteed pricing on crops. So you basically had a system. And John talks about the system, but obviously in 2011 that system collapses because the uprising begins. So then the men became refugees in situ. So they became refugees in Lebanon, where if they went back and they hadn't done service, if they got conscripted, my God, they'd now be sent to go and fight against their relatives who were fighting.
Yeah.
And also, if their brothers had joined the Free Syrian Army, their brothers needed and their family needed the economic support of the men working in Lebanon. So you had a kind of division of labor within the family, where if a man had done military service and had military experience, he was then more likely to join one of these emergent militias like the Free Syrian Army or what have you. His younger brother who hadn't would work and send cash in the form of remittances back to Lebanon to support his family. So his brother was doing revolutionary labor and his younger brother was doing physical labor in order to make money, in order to sustain the family.
What a conundrum that is.
Yeah, and that became my PhD, and then my first book was studying that. And
so when you were in that phase and when you were looking, I mean, this is a fascinating story that way, but did you realize, I think ethnography gives you that leverage, isn't it, to really sort of dive into what's happening, and sometimes you do it yourself, which quite often is the case. But did you realize at that moment this is just bigger than maybe the economics or maybe the migration side of it, or is it about power politics? And more importantly, when we talk about refugees, is it about survival for them?
So, because it's ethnography, like you say, ethnography as a method, I like the traditional kind of definition of it. It's that it allows us to see the difference between what people say they do and what they actually do. So, the way in which the method allows that is that we just spend so long in the field that if someone tells you something in an interview, you get to see the reality underneath. So ethnography is all about finding these nuances between how we present ourselves and how we actually act. So, for example, the desire to build a better life for themselves in exile among Syrians, a lot of the men would say things like, I do not want to have a life for myself in Lebanon. My home is in Syria. I am waiting for the fall of Bashar al-Assad. And I wrote this book. Bashar al-Assad was still in power when it came out. I'm waiting for the fall of Bashar al-Assad, then I'll return. But then in reality, what are they actually doing? They were opening small businesses. They were starting to get married. They were coming up with financial schemes and ideas on how to move out of their current class position into different class positions, which went down to even intimate levels of, like, for instance, I write a chapter about what it means to be a Syrian man in Beirut, and how the men would go to this market in Sabra and they would say things like, I'm looking for clothes that looks like it's from H&M, right? Mm-hmm. It's not from H&M, but they're looking for things that they're thinking of looks like H&M, which used to be on the main street in Beirut, in order to navigate themselves within the city and not to be recognized as a refugee, because none of these are just young men wanting to have fun in the city. They don't want to be, as no one would want to be facing racism. So they were not passive in the face of that racism, though they tried to navigate it using symbols of class and identity, and then were using that to try and get Lebanese girlfriends, and just try to show that they were doing a lot of the things that other men in their 20s would do, far away from the village, living in Beirut for the first time, despite all of the other stuff that's going on back home in Syria.
So this is also an interesting case of identity, interplay of identity for them, isn't it? Where they are sort of looking for their own selves in the environment within which they are sort of going back and forth.
And you have to remember that with like Lebanese and Syrian, in terms of like surface level differences, they all look basically the same, right? The difference is that Syrians and Lebanese Arabic is slightly different, pronunciation and tone and some vocabulary words. And then the real difference is just like physical markers of class, as in clothes. So some of them, for example, the ones who are the guys I know from the far east of Syria, would speak trying to speak a Khaliji, a Gulfi dialect, to try and suggest that they're wealthy Gulfis, right? The other ones who are from more closer to Beirut would just switch into a more Lebanese dialect, and then they would try and use that to navigate their identity, and it's much more. It was very interesting to look at the role of clothes and accent because they're much more manipulatable than other identity characteristics. So they could actually play with these identities in the city. And there's the other dimensions of it is that when the men who were fighting would leave the front line for breaks, they would come and they would be, some of them would be in military fatigues. They would have adopted a kind of militarized masculinity. And then my friends would take me aside and be like, "Oh, my brother, he doesn't know life in the city like me." They would try like say, even though he was winning a kind of revolutionary political prestige, they would try and bring it back with a sort of urbane masculinity.
Wow, that must be fascinating. I sort of diving into it, but I'm very keen on your, how you framed your Rebel Populism, the book. Obviously, when refugees first come, they come into Lebanon. Of course, you've been telling us through their stories, but the transformation where the mindset is so bent on the economic side of it, you are pursuing those opportunities, looking for those opportunities, but you are in that indefinite exile. And then suddenly something clicks in where you are thinking about that revolution, from where you are situated. Suddenly you're thinking about uprising.
Yeah.
How did you see that, and how did you frame that in your piece?
So that's a essential part of the book is that within the sort of academic scholarship of the Arab Spring, a huge percentage, the vast majority of it, has focused on sort of middle class, upper class, bourgeois activists who sided with the revolutions, right? It hasn't concentrated on the everyday, ordinary people who joined the revolution. So when we say mass movement, we have a lot of work on the kind of movement entrepreneurs, the people who try and provoke, shape, or or generate a movement, but not on the actual mass part of the mass movement. So I was very interested in why these men all supported the uprising. Of course, we know the crimes of Bashar al-Assad, etc., right? But as a purely academic question, I wanted to know why did they support it? And I initially didn't even want to ask that question. When I was beginning, I'm a strange white Brit, right? So to make myself seem like what a researcher would look like, even though I'm an anthropologist, I had got a clipboard. This is advice I had. Take a clipboard and do a survey because you look like what people think a researcher is. It's weird if you say, "Can I just hang out on this construction site with you every night?" which is what I wanted to do. But so I went with my clipboard. And then I asked them questions about how much land they had in Syria, how they were farming it, what crops they grew, what villages they were from, what they knew their fathers did, and et cetera, et cetera. And then the guy says to me, "You're not going to ask me about Bashar al-Assad?" So I was like, okay.
You walk right into it.
So I was like, okay, these men are undergoing a revolutionary transformation. And the reason is that the theory I set out in that book, and what I mean by rebel populism, is that the men were not particularly part of any distinct political movement. Yes, their brothers joined the Free Syrian Army, but they were not socialists or Islamists, or they didn't prescribe to a distinct ideology, despite how we might think about how revolutions are captured or whatever. Instead, they kind of understood the world through a combination of their own patriarchal ideals and then also the kind of ideologies that they were taught in school, which is Baathism. So they would, and also, of course, the words that they were hearing circulated on Al Jazeera and whatever. So a lot of the men would say things like, "We want free expression. We want a free press. We want human rights," right? And that would lead a critical scholar or a different scholar to conclude that somehow these men had been tricked by Al Jazeera to forward, Western ideals of a sort of civil spring, like this sort of idea.
That's the first cry. They do it here as well when we talk about, some of those things which we are seeing at the moment. But yes, sorry, carry on.
Yeah. So it of course doesn't make that much sense for a worker to say, I want like a free press, right? I mean, of course we have to take that seriously, but then the more I spent time with them, I understood that this way of talking actually formed a kind of what is this a bit very academic, but Ernesto Leclau calls an empty signifier. These are empty signifiers, as in these are words that can be filled with meaning.
Mm-hmm.
So it wouldn't make sense for the worker to say, I want socialism, right? Because the word socialism was monopolized by the Syrian government. The Syrian government's slogan is Wahde Hurriya Ishtirakiyya, unity, freedom, and socialism, right? So it has socialism within its core. So it doesn't make sense to say that. But this language is outside of the sort of language that had been monopolized by the state. So it functions as a language of opposition. And then so after I'd done a lot of field work, I then did very focused life history interviews and very focused interviews after people got to know me and they trusted me, where I tried to uncover what is the vision of a good life for them. And the vision of a good life is essentially the life that their fathers had before them, which was the life that was actually generated under the earlier form of the Ba'ath Party when it did try. I mean, this is not to say any sort of justification of that party, but to say that when it had pursued an economic model that sought to win over the rural communities in Syria through guaranteed pricing on crops, through infrastructure development, through sort of state-led development projects. And that allowed the men to then be the single breadwinners. It allowed them to go to Lebanon, earn a bit of extra capital, open a business back home, and basically perform a kind of a masculine trajectory, which is what other scholars have called it, like going through particular stages as a man. So it was not a revolution against patriarchy. It was not a revolution in favor of a kind of liberal bourgeois democracy. I see it as a kind of an attempt to restore the bits of good things that their fathers had that had then disappeared. Yeah. And that's what I mean by rebel populism. I mean that it was a populist uprising without any distinct leaders that kind of express these basic material antagonisms using a language that doesn't necessarily reflect what they actually demand. I know that's quite complicated.
No, but
so
I think
you read the book, but yeah.
you very well framed that argument in your book, and it is a fascinating read that way. And linked to that, we now come to the labor of displacement, because your work again. We talk about formal labor, in the Lebanon's construction industry, and then you've got that invisible part of maintaining that connection to family, to the survival. So the question is, how does that actual labor of displacement look like on a day-to-day basis? Again, you had a front view seat to that, didn't you?
Well, there's so many. There's so many different ways in which, so people are always working, right? Mm-hmm. People are always working. And the idea, so I can broaden this out a bit from Syria and Lebanon. And, if you look at standard sort of humanitarian type statistics, or in fact, if you go and ask conflict affected people themselves, are you working? Often they'll say no, right? But if I could spend more time with them as an anthropologist, I would find that they are in fact working, right? Most people are working because we live under capitalism, where in order to gain access to a wage, we have to sell our labor power, or we have to do some sort of livelihood generating activity. So most people are working all of the time. And that work takes many different forms. So for example, back to the Middle East, I remember hearing about a Syrian refugee camp in Jordan, where some of the workers there, some of the younger men were building replica matchstick models of famous sort of sites in Syria and selling it to aid workers.
Wow.
Right? Yeah. So there's this sort of like work that goes on alongside the aid sector.
Very enterprising.
Very entrepreneurial. Even the, Kareem, cut that, sorry. What do I call him in the book? Abdullah. Kareem's his real name. I have to use fake names. Okay. So even Abdullah, in my book, he was so fed up of working for someone else, he decided to start his own vegetable market, and he did so even though he knew it would likely be a real economic challenge. But he wanted to do that because he wanted to, he was married. He has a natural, what we say, like a gift of the gab. He's a very good talker. And it allowed him to kind of try to recover a sense of prestige that he was losing through being in a permanently exploited position. And now, had he had the right level of support, I think he probably would have been very successful at that. But you can see that there's always this drive to escape particular conditions, to act entrepreneurially. And I think that often, if you want to switch, we can talk about how the aid system, it doesn't always allow for that.
Yeah.
And when it tries, it often fails. And if you take something like that instinct, one better aid response would be to support people like Kareem trying to move into these areas. But of course, it's so complicated because we're also dealing with particular laws that might limit the ability of a displaced person if they've crossed a national border to open their own business, etc.
I'll be honest with you. What you're saying really aligns with what I'm trying to look at, on a very, very different level. But you see how displaced individuals, they want to leverage everything which they have, whatever soft skills they have, to do something, and it's not out of choice, but necessity. And you've documented something very similar, where we are looking at how they contribute to the informal economy, the support network. But then, if you look at it, how the Western system of migration and the systems which are in place, how it completely shuts that human element of it. So, again, as an expert on your part, when you look at the survival strategies of these individuals, what is your take on how it connects to the broader humanitarian economy, especially in Lebanon, if we could have some examples, where the workers, they were part of that formal system, or you saw them completely out of it in the shadows?
I think it's really important to be clear that the humanitarian system is not the singular actor when it comes to like refugees' labor rights. So you also have to interact with the state and the Lebanese state. If you were registered with UNHCR as a refugee, you lost your ability to work on the Lebanese labor market formally. Of course, people informally work. So the extent of the interaction of the aid sector, it's kind of limited because, of course, while we know that even if a refugee signs a pledge to the Lebanese state saying they're not going to work, they are going to work because the distributions and support they're getting from the aid system is not enough to support their lives. So they are going to have to work. But the aid system, which is a formal body, can't then be seen to facilitating access to work for people who've registered as refugees. So then you instead have like lots of different kind of schemes that try to get people's an ability to work. So you have cash, this thing called cash for work, which is such a weird thing to say because all work should be for cash, but cash for work. So you have cash for work schemes. You have sometimes you'll even have things like many times I've seen like skills training type activities where I know that the person doesn't probably have the formal right to actually work in that thing that they're being trained for, and that's quite a problem. So one can argue, for example, that it's probably not really for the aid system, but potentially for more for development organizations or those who are trying to interlink the two, to be advocating for refugee rights to work. We do have a huge body of evidence that shows that actually, increasing the ability for refugees to work and start businesses, etc., would actually cause an economic benefit to a country, particularly if you have individuals who are bringing in a certain amount of capital or they have certain skills that are missing, etc. But we have to remember that political economy is a messy beast, right? Yeah. There are also people who benefit from refugees not having the right to work. So, for example, in Lebanon, when they tried to implement a labor sponsorship system, the kafala system, which is the sponsorship system common that people might know from the Gulf, where the person who brings you into the country takes your passport. It's essentially a form of modern day slavery. They tried to bring a similar labor sponsorship system in for Syrian workers. Syrian bosses did not want to pay for this system because they want to have precarious, cheap workers, right? Syrian, normally we see the kafala system as this incredibly abusive, and it is, of course, abusive system of labor control. However, Syrian workers, at least some who told me, they want the kafala system because they want the boss to have to financially invest in their ability to be in the country, because then they think that will then give them better leverage over wages and also protect them from arbitrary dismissal. You see,
so it's a paradox that way.
It's a paradox.
Yes.
It's a paradox, and what the system can do in these situations in order to increase the ability for refugees to work is really a difficult one. I would say more careful diplomatic advocacy. Potentially, it's for different organisations like the International Labour Organization and others to be pushing for that right. But yeah, I wish there was a straightforward answer to that problem. I mean, we have it in my own. We have it in Britain, right? Yes. We have it in Britain. We know that it would make infinitely more sense to give people the right to work while waiting for their cases to be processed by the Home Office. Instead, for some unknown reason, we spend the Overseas Development Assistance Fund to put them in hotels that angers the far right and damages the economy. I mean, instead, if people were working formally, they would be paying taxes. Even from the logic of the state, it doesn't make sense. It's instead from a logic of politics, and it's not performed for the economy. It's not done for the economy. It's done for the electorate, and it's done for political reasons. It makes no sense, even from the interests of financial interests, to be placing, except for the, of course, political economy is messy, for the financial interests of the hotel owners who get guaranteed occupancy in a contract with the state.
It's all about economization of politics that way, isn't it?
Yeah. But the other side could win. The other side also, there's also an interest for the economy to have refugees working. Yeah. But instead, it's to the interest of these hotel owners and also the politicians who don't want to, who think that people would be upset if refugees were working. Yet we know that it's not like one job enters, one job goes. Like, this is not how the economy works. One job enters, formalizes, pays taxes, more service, more state level services. Maybe that person then brings their family. Maybe then they have to start buying more food. This is not, the economy is not one in, one out.
yeah, it's not a zero-sum game. And at the end of the day, it's all about having that political will to make those changes, which, again, I feel we've been discussing this on other episodes with individuals. It has all come down to the political will and desire to make those changes, because some of the systems which are out there is dated, completely dated, and they don't want to make any changes to that.
Exactly.
But then, coming back to what you were talking about, so do you see displacement working as infrastructure? And, what is this system actually designed to produce at all?
So on that point, and you said it very clearly in your introduction, we need to have a deeper historical understanding of displacement. Yes. Displacement is how most cities were built. Most of human history until the invention of the nation state was people moving either through war or through opportunity. It was constant movement, and that led to the development of things like agriculture, to the development of modern farming techniques. Movement is the entire history of humanity, and then we invent the nation state and passports and categories called refugee and IDP and all of this stuff, and then this becomes a problem. But actually, historically, it was not a significant problem. It was actually part of what it meant to be a human being on planet Earth. So we have to historicize it in that sense. And what we instead find is that within that system, a large part, and this is a critique that many have made, not just me, the aid system functions as an infrastructure of containment, of crisis containment. So it used to be, there's been a big change, but over time, the aid system went from a moral, mission-driven, need-driven pursuit where people said no one should suffer and die and starve, and that this is just something that we as humans have agreed that we'll address, to then increasingly a tool of global North government, of containment. So they say, we don't want lots of refugees coming across the Mediterranean, so we'll deploy the humanitarian system in South Sudan to try, for example, and stabilize the conflict in South Sudan. There's been another shift now with Gaza, where it's no longer that they want the humanitarian system to function as the containment infrastructure for displacement. Now they're hiring, private security corporate firms like the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation to do the work that used to be done of the UN, that shouldn't really have ever been the true spirit of the mission of the UN and of humanitarians anyway. So we see this progression, and I would say that the aid system has allowed itself, through losing its moral mission, which is, I see it less as like in this, I don't think it should be this paternalistic, we want to help you. It should be, we do want to help you, but it should be like a helping hand. It should be in solidarity. It should be taking whatever people's capacities and skills are and strengthening them in a condition of displacement so they can build dignified lives on their own terms. That's how it should be. In my view, we've moved from that to the current point we are now historically, which is the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, or there's another organization called Fogbo that is doing airdrops in South Sudan directly in line with the government. So I think, we've moved sort of from displacement to containment now by private corporate entities, and all of this fundamentally goes against, I think, our human nature,
so which is to want to move. Absolutely. I think the basic principle is lost here in terms of the humans who are the beneficiaries, or who should be the beneficiaries of that.
Yeah.
But then comes the question of, you mentioned about solidarity, there comes the question of, in today's world where we've got, someone leading United States of America, you've got what's happening in Ukraine and Russia, the geopolitical situation in Middle East and the Africa. Then what would it mean, if not aid? What would solidarity mean to support the people, especially the displaced individual? How would it take shape, and how should we go about it from a very common sense, logical point of view, if that is correct?
Yeah. So there are 100% cases where very traditional aid is needed and should be scaled up immediately. Gaza and Sudan are two key examples where they are on famine, or are not going to go on famine, or very close to the edge of famine. So there are still cases.
Contextual? Do you mean very contextual?
Yeah, contextual. So there is a role for traditional aid. So let me give you a very quick example in Gaza. Like, let us pretend that the statement Hamas are stealing food or stealing aid is 100% true. We're just saying it's true. The aid system in those situations has a mechanism of response, which is to flood a territory with so much food that it no longer becomes a target for banditry, because you can't make any money selling it because there's so much food.
It becomes a supply-demand.
Supply-demand. So Israel has choked off the supply. Thus the demand has increased. Thus they claim we're stopping the supply in order to stop it going into the hands of Hamas. But if we say that's true, what they're actually doing is creating a distortion in the market that then allows Hamas to want to get it, because there's so little of it, to control it. So when you're asking me how I cope, this is the one that makes me feel like I've gone mad. Like, I feel like I've gone mad having to explain this. Since in Afghanistan, in Somalia, everywhere, the strategy has always been banditry will happen if you have a choke in the supply, flood the territory with food, so it no longer becomes a target for banditry. So there are 100% cases where that sort of traditional aid system is warranted, where you have like people in an emergency situation who need food. Now, there are other situations where solidarity forms of aid, or different sort of aid modalities, would be more useful. So, for example, I'll give you an example from South Sudan. So I worked with the UN OCHA, the Office for Coordinating Humanitarian Affairs in South Sudan, on something called the Flagship Initiative, where they tried to, within the formal system, develop a way of identifying things that people want that aren't within the standard humanitarian shopping list, or at least to try and ask them in a way that wasn't just a survey. So in South Sudan has a strong aid dependency, and that aid dependency is an ugly word, but what it actually means in the South Sudanese context is that South Sudanese people who've been long-term displaced will know what particular UN agencies deliver. So if it's WFP, they'll say we need food, right? If it's UNDP, they'll say we need this access road. If it's the WASH cluster, they'll say, we need, they know how it works, right? And then this is entrepreneurial as well. This is learning how a system works and how to manipulate it. But it doesn't necessarily help transition from a permanent crisis into recovery. So one thing, as an example of solidarity, would be in South Sudan, if there is a farming community that lacks the resources, time, or technology to build a traditional sort of granary that stores the grain, and they say, we're harvesting now, but we can't store it and dry it out. We need a granary. Build a granary. That would be solidarity, right? Because they're doing something they've always done. Their ancestors have done. They're farming, and then you're coming along and building the granary. It would be like, for me, I'm an academic. If my computer was taken away in a war, if someone gives me a computer, well, I've got the skills now. I can do my work again. So this is the same sort of figure out what people need that might not necessarily be one of the standard items, and figure out a way to fund it, to help people transition back into lives on their own terms, instead of the humanitarian system keeping people trapped in a permanent state of emergency.
Absolutely. Yeah. So there's no discontinuation into the life. Yeah. Of course, we can't replace what they have gone through, but at least there's a real effort to help them with what they really want. No, thank you for that. Yeah. Now, I just want to draw, and this is something very important with regards to what we are talking about. I know we've spoken a lot about the system, a lot about the process and the aid, but I want to focus firmly on, and this is one of those questions where we look at these communities, how they maintain their identity and dignity, and not just across one generation. And you're the best person to answer this. When displacement has become permanent, look at what's happening in Palestine. Again, there are so many other examples we could talk about it, but people should know, how do these individuals, they maintain or at least resist that, it's their identity and they want to have their own dignity, which I feel, for example, dropping that aid, 8-ton aid through a parachute rather than bringing a truck in, is a huge, it attacks their dignity that way, where they're all running towards, and this is a very simple definition that way. But what do you think about this? How do they maintain their dignity and identity when it comes to the intervention from outside?
So in the context of Gaza, there's a Palestinian concept called samud, and it kind of means sort of steadfastness, resistance, maintaining yourself. From having spoken to a lot of Gazans, I know that there's a sense of hesitancy around discussing things like samud or dignity or resistance in the current moment, because they feel, and I think it's right to feel this way, that the genocide is the overwhelming problem. And the question of maintaining dignity and of resiliency and things like this in the face of something that significant is really is a really big ask. So I think we have to think about different contexts as well. So if we take Syrians in Lebanon who are working in construction, I was very interested in the question of how they maintained a sense of dignity, because dignity, in Arabic karame, this was one of the main demands, a restoration of dignity. This is what people wanted, dignity. Yeah, they wanted dignity. They spotted the revolution because they wanted dignity, and they felt indignity in the way in which they were being treated in Lebanon. So some of the ways in which they restored it were those that I mentioned earlier, which is, so this is the kind of thinking, I would say we would eat with our hands at the big central plate, which is how people would eat in Deir ez-Zor in eastern Syria, and they would bring it into the city and maintain and keep that cultural tradition of eating with your hand from a big central plate. Lebanese, of course, don't do that. They eat with knives and forks, and they're fancy, right? And the men would both know, people, we would never patronize people, right? They knew that if a Lebanese saw it, they would think that it was somehow lacking dignity. But in their view, it was the most dignified way of eating, because this is, of course, how the Prophet Muhammad ate, and it's how they'd eaten for all of their ancestors. And they would say things like to me, Philip, your Lebanese friends would die if they saw you eating like this, no? So there's a playing with the idea of dignity, and then on even like day-to-day stuff, like for example, a lot of the men would live on construction sites, and they would build shacks out of breeze blocks, and I would go into them, and then I would see that they put in, one guy found a television and installed a television, and it had a weird like green filter on. Another guy had like installed made a phone dock out of a smaller brick and a big brick that he cut up and put together, right? And they'd installed a clothing rack, and that they put a cover around the shower, and all of this stuff like was just everyday kind of restoration of dignity. And then they would also take great pleasure and laugh about like how they would get one over on their bosses, as workers often do. So they would say they would convince the manager the foreman in like a Christian town that they were all very Muslim and they must pray 5 times a day, but they were actually just going off for cigarettes. This kind of like playing and recovering and resisting. This goes on, I think, like all the time amongst displaced people, and as it does, within our own working lives, in our own academic departments. If we have fights, we sometimes try and figure out how to get one over on this way and restore our sense of dignity. A promotion is denied, but don't worry, I'm going to do this thing. We always are doing that anyway as human beings. So
but I find you very lucky for having seen that in your own eyes in a very different cultural foreplay, in front of you. But that's a very good expression.
We shouldn't think they're so different from me. I grew up in a rural northern English town, and then I moved to the big city in my 20s. I'm from a northern working class background, and they're also from working class background. Very different in other ways, but the sort of movement from the country to the city, from a small village to big place of anonymity, that we had some things in common on those levels.
But there are parallels that way, which we can.
And also, anthropology works. It only works when you're an outsider, really. There's these debates around the native anthropologist or the inside anthropologist, but obviously, if I was in the north and some southerner from southern England comes and they want to study like, post-industrial society in northern England, I'd be like, what the hell, go away, right? But if they were a Syrian guy, I'd be like, wow, you want to study northern England? Let me tell you all about it. And that's how it works, basically.
Absolutely. Yeah. So, no, I think that was a powerful explanation of what you just mentioned. So I'm going to switch gears now, if that's all right. We're going to go to the lightning round of this segment. I'm going to have 6 very one-word questions to you. So if you could just give us some of your key terms around this. So just a first thought. So if I ask you one word to describe life inside displacement.
I don't know. My entire thing is that it can't be described in one word.
Okay. I'll take that.
It can't be described. It can't. It's natural. Natural. Displacement is a natural condition.
Can I put word in your mouth? Could it be intuitive? Could it be sort of, this is how human beings are? We're meant to survive. We're meant to go on with what's happening around us, no matter what.
Yeah, nature.
All right. The most misunderstood thing about the aid, humanitarian aid.
The most misunderstood thing about humanitarian aid. The numbers.
The numbers. Okay. Okay.
I can tell you more about that, but okay, we say the numbers. Okay.
I'll come to that. Okay. Informal market or formal aid, which supports more people?
Informal market. Absolutely no question. Informal market.
Okay. And what's more powerful in exile, community or money?
The romantic in me wants to say community, but the truth is probably money.
Money. Okay, I'm so glad you said that. Okay.
Yeah.
A moment in your field work that completely changed how you saw power. Again, I know it's not a one word, but
Okay, well, it was when there were increased levels of suspicion being asked about me by a political party affiliated guy, and the workers were able to defend me in such a way that the situation was diffused, even though he was a part of a party that is opposed to their politics.
Wow.
But even though they would in theory be disempowered, through their personal relationships, they were able to calm the situation, and I wasn't then seen as a spy, basically.
That's a great example of power that way in a different world. Now, could you complete this sentence for me, please? Displacement is not about movement. It's about what?
I said rights.
Rights. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So that brings us to the end of this section. I'm very mindful of the time, an hour, but I've just got a few more questions and then we'll close things off. Now, what you do, Philip, in terms of your position as a researcher, having lived alongside people, workers, and you've documented their struggle as well. It is important from your perspective and for us and for my audience to understand, how do you actually navigate the ethics of it all? You have the responsibility of telling their stories.
Yeah.
But then how do you actually navigate that ethics, the different dimensions of ethics while you're doing it and while you're writing it?
There's different visions of ethics, right? There's ethics as our university processes, which are like ethical risk management. So how do I ethically manage the risk? Well, I'll answer that first just because it's easy. If it's a very, very high risk situation with people who become politically aligned with a particular force that might get them in trouble, as in Syria and Lebanon, I use a method called composite characters. So there's no point changing people's names in the Middle East because there's not that many names. So it's identifying details that allows you to find out who someone is. So you move the basic identifying details between and across individuals, and you create a new character in the process. So, if one guy's from Deir ez-Zor and he has a good story, you take that story and you put it on someone who's from Idlib, and you move that story across and you build this scheme like this, and then you can functionally entirely protect people's identities while still keeping a compelling ethnographic narrative. This is the highest level of risk management for difficult ethnography, and that allows you to do the research in an ethical managed way. Now, the broader philosophical question of the ethics is that I prefer to answer those questions with an ethical attack. So I think it is not ethical to live in a world where the experiences of Syrian displaced Syrians, construction workers, people from the global majority, people from the working class, are lost forever and never recorded. I think that's unethical. Therefore, the ethical response is to seek to record and document and preserve those stories. So I see the activity of an anthropologist as a profoundly ethical endeavor, providing they are themselves ethical people, and of course, the thing to say about that is that aligns with how the men viewed me. So they viewed what I was doing. One of my most powerful and saddest moments in my fieldwork was when I was leaving. I'm going to start crying now. When one of the older guys said that they couldn't believe that someone from Britain would come and spend so long with them and try to record their thoughts, feelings, their histories to preserve that moment. And for them, it was such an unbelievable thing that someone would even take an interest in them because they feel and experience such marginalization. So I think that's a profoundly ethical endeavor. And now, of course, I am enmeshed in vast power dynamics like everyone else. While I might come from a working class background, I'm still an academic. I still live in England. I still have the ability to come in and out of Lebanon. I have the freedom that my passport affords me. What do we ethically do in a world where that exists? Do we not do this kind of research, or do we use or attempt to use the forms of power and privilege that we do have in order to magnify the voices of others? And that's what I've always tried to do with my political work and with my academic work is to take that position. I have these things, I'm not not some British aristocrat, but I have certain amounts of power and privilege, and then I can use that to try to do this sort of these activities. So even if you take my the accountability archive thing that I'm working on, where we're recording these power holders' speeches. I enjoy relative degrees of sort of freedom of expression that other people might not have, freedom to organize, freedom to do these things. So I use it to try and do this project to assist the Palestinian cause as best as I can. I also think it's ethical because as academics, we're always asking ourselves, what should I be doing in the face of this? What should I be doing? Well, one of the ethical things to do is to take our skills in qualitative coding and data collection and all of our geeky skills and put it to the service of creating a historical record of how another genocide has been allowed to happen. So I try to have that position that our work is that we should not see unethical. We should not be defensive ethically. We should say, actually, maybe it is ethical in and of itself to do this.
And that's what defines us. And that's what brought me to the next question, which you rightly answered in terms of the impact your work is having on the communities you're writing about. And that showed the connection which you had with individuals who you worked with and who you documented their lives and struggles. So, you are inspiring a new generation of academia and scholars, I believe, irrespective of the discipline. Because that's where we should stand in terms of what we are working and close that gap between academic and political action. My last question to you, and I promise to shut up after this, would be your learning around the relationship of accountability rather than extraction, which we see in and around us. And we as researchers, we often go into the field, we collect the data, and off we go to conferences, journals, we write papers. But what would you tell new researchers and academics as well about building a relationship of accountability and moving away from that extraction mindset?
So the most work that I'm doing on accountability, because I actually was doing academic work on accountability from the AIDS section, I think is instructive to this question, is that the way in which the AIDS system has often understood accountability is not how me and you would understand accountability. They understand accountability as here's an example, it's just a fabricated example. We built you this access road into the camp. Do you like it? Yes, no. 50% said no. Okay, we've been held accountable, right? That's how I'm joking, but that is kind of, if you look at the sort of studies of accountability in humanitarian crises contexts or with displaced people, you'll find it often. There's even a great paper, I can't remember the author, but it was with ODI. It's called Accountability is Feedback. So essentially they just thought accountability means feedback. But what does accountability mean? Accountability means, if you've done something I don't like and I tell you I don't like that road, that means either you come and fix the road or you come and give me something else instead of the road. I don't want the road, I want a granary. It means the ability to influence the decisions that people are making in line with your feedback. So it has to have a loop. So I think that accountability for academics is that when we do our research, if an individual does no longer wish to be in the research, they should have the right to entirely remove themselves from the research. This is not a simple form that we hand out. It is, I constantly, if somebody said something about that I thought was sensitive, I would say, do you want me to write that? How do you want me to write that? If it was really sensitive, if it was something that I thought would get them in trouble. And now I faced a particular dilemma with this. So, the way I've talked about it, it should be clear that the men had undergone a revolutionary transformation. They wanted to talk about Bashar al-Assad. I was initially hesitant with my dictaphone. They would grab it off me and speak into the dictaphone, was like giving little political sermons. And then I would say, I'm going to use pseudonyms before I even was doing composite characters. And I would do pseudonyms. What pseudonym do you want? And they're like, I don't want a fake name. Put my name down. And I was like, well, it's not, I can't be accountable to you if you go back and then you get arrested because this book is being read by the Syrian Mukhabarat, the Syrian secret police. So, it's accountability. We have to be flexible. We have to be context aware. We have to create constant opportunities for individuals to change our practice if they are not happy with it. And we have to, it's not just a form that people sign. It's a constant reminder that I am there to help you as much as you are to help me, whilst never romanticizing that point, because I also dislike it when scholars don't pretend, as you correctly just said, by the way, that we go and we do this and we should do this, but at the end, we are still gaining information that we put into journals that then advances our career.
Which is where everything stops in a way, and then we move on to a next topic or next subject altogether. And this is why I wanted you on this podcast. And on this podcast, we talk a lot about the broken system. And I feel, coming from academia, kind of feels it's broken. People don't have the full picture, especially when you are researching a sensitive area like the refugee, which I don't like the word refugee as such, but then when we're talking about displaced individual, it really takes away, it's all about romanticizing those individuals, a group of people, but then you're in a way, you're overlooking the problems which is more permanent in their life. So, like I said, my last question to you, and then we'll move on. So the broken system, building in the broken system. Could you give me your thoughts on what it means to you personally, or does it actually is it my fancy altogether? What does building in the broken system mean when you think about refugees and displaced individuals?
The aid system is broken. So they are building lives within a broken system. So the aid system was broken before the rise of Trump and the collapsing of USAID and things like that. The system was broken in the sense that, what was it supposed to do? It was supposed to provide temporary relief in a period of emergency. But what actually has been happening over the past 10, 15 years is the number. So we have this term in humanitarian aid called protracted crisis. You may have heard of it. So a protracted crisis it has a technical definition, which is a country that's had more than 5 years of coordinated UN humanitarian appeals. So it means it's had a big humanitarian funding appeal for more than 5 years. Those protracted crises were growing year on year on year on year. And the aid system which was designed to be a temporary response to an acute emergency, then you pull back and then development actors come in. That hasn't been happening. So instead, displaced people have been living in a broken system, in a permanent state of emergency, where essentially, some of these conflicts, the front lines have been fixed for many years, yet nonetheless, this displaced camp still exists. Water is still being trucked in. No one's building a water tower or a bore or anything. And they're kept trapped in this permanent system. And you see attempts by displaced people to try and recover a sense of life within this broken system. So I remember reading this great paper about how refugees in Jordan rearranged the containers in order to build their own homes. So they joined the container up, drilled through the wall, and then built within it like a big open plan kitchen, which the guy called an American kitchen, right? And that's people still within a system that says, actually, you can't have permanence. You have to be in this container, and you have to be in these individual containers rather than as a family unit. And instead they say, no, I'm not doing that. I'm going to push these together and I'm going to drill the hole through and I'm going to turn it into something else. We see, the history of Palestinian displacement in Lebanon started from tents to this being allowed, to this being allowed. Oh, you can have corrugated roof, you can't have corrugated roof. All of this stuff is broken. And while the sort of idea of humanitarianism in crisis is as old as humanitarianism itself, we have to acknowledge that since around 2008, really the financial crisis onwards, we've seen the aid system and then the increasing levels of kind of wars, endless wars without political resolutions, constant simmering conflict is growing and growing and growing, and then within that, displaced people just being forgotten about in many conflicts, not just the ones that make the news anymore. From you had DRC and in Latin America, there's so many people who are displaced who are just forgotten about, and the system can't address them. It can't because the fundamental problem is the nation state. And the idea that this nation state doesn't want these people here, but it would quite like some of the money from the humanitarian system.
Yeah, and there's a stat going around displaced individuals as well. And let's not forget the people displaced because of climate disasters as well.
Exactly, which will only increase.
Which will only increase, absolutely.
And it's a nexus anyway. It becomes difficult to say what's conflict, what's climate. You can look at a map and you can see that where there's I wish I knew who made the map, but there's a map that shows where there were US drone strikes and where there's desertification. And you can see that where a desert is encroaching, you're more likely to get a US drone strike.
That's such an interesting take. Yes. No, thank you for that. That was really fascinating, Philip. Thank you so much.
I hope it was good, and I hope I was not too rambly. I have a tendency to ramble.
Enjoy. I hope you enjoyed the conversation as well.
Yeah, I very much did.
Would you want to highlight any piece of your work, or would you want to give a shout out to anything which you'd want to?
I would just encourage people to use the Accountability Archive. So the webpage, on Twitter, it's Archive Genocide, and there they'll find a link that allows you to upload evidence of power holders advocating for the violation of international humanitarian law, because I think it's really important, while we have critiques of the international system, that at this time we need to defend it, and we also need to document how it's been broken.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. With that, I will formally close the session. Philip, thank you so much. You have borne witness. You have been challenging the machinery of displacement. And most importantly, I followed you for a very long time, and you've continued to remind us that survival isn't just passive, it's very political. Your work has shown us that displacement isn't just about movement, it's about system control, labor, and more importantly, resistance. So I'll give a shout out to your book, Rebel Populism. I think you could get it on Amazon, if I'm correct.
Yeah, and I'm doing a paperback version soon. It's going to come out. It won't be a while, but I'm writing a new introduction since the fall of Bashar al-Assad.
Brilliant. Yeah, that'll be a fascinating read. And again, you can also follow Philip's ongoing work at IDS, Institute of Development Studies. And finally, to my audience, if this episode at all pushed you to rethink aid, exile, displacement, and what it means to build in a broken system, please make sure you share us, tag us, and join the conversation. This is Builders of the Broken Bazaar. I'm Dr. Tabish Zaman. Until next time, see you again.